far I'll get, or if I'll even get to the new one tonight. But if you look at what we were saying is the price for saying no. And in that price of saying no, we looked at basically how King Xerxes had decided to impress everybody, and he wanted his wife to do something that she didn't want to do, and as a result she said no, and the king didn't like that. And the atmosphere, we looked at the atmosphere to get an understanding of the times, and this wasn't a once-off party that they just partied. They've been partying for 24 hours for a time of 6 months. So that's a big party. And the Bible doesn't say he was drunk. It says he was merry. But I just would like you to think about having a party for 6 months, what merry might entail. Would that impinge upon your cognitive senses? Would you be well and truly with it? Or would you be sort of on a little bit of a high? And that gives you an idea of what the king was and who he was trying to impress. And we looked at how he wanted to, in that atmosphere, and we looked at a bit of the Jewish origins, or the Midrash as it's called, to give us some behind the scenes tensions that were possible. It's not saying they were, but you can understand when there's a lot of men getting talking and they're a bit on the merry side, and the topic came up, who was the most beautiful woman in the kingdom, and one group said the Persians, the other said the Medes, and of course the king wasn't having any of that. He said, no, my wife Vashti is, and yet she's a Babylonian. And they said, that's fine, prove it, bring her out. And the idea was that she wore nothing but a crown, because they wanted to see her beauty. And of course this is what he exercised his authority. He wanted to impress these guys, and so he commanded that she be brought out to show off her beauty. And of course the queen had the audacity to say, it's not going to happen, no way. And it says the king Xerxes wasn't used to having anyone say no, particularly his wife. And so he had to put his foot down. And he wasn't going to let her get away with this, because basically he was burning inside. He'd lost face between those men he was trying to impress, that he had all these 127 provinces, that he was the king, and he had the power of life and death, and he commanded his wife to do something and she said no. So they wondered, well, what sort of power have you really got? And so he'd lost face. We saw the concern that was expressed by these people, and particularly Xerxes. He didn't want to lose face, and so in these verses he has an assessment. Now, he could have made the decision himself, as we said. He could have fixed this whole thing and said, look, I'm sorry I got Mary, I'm sorry I made a fool of myself, and I apologise to you, I apologise to my wife, it won't happen again. Easy, isn't it? But no, he was a proud man, an egotistic sort of a bloke, and instead of making the decision himself, he wanted to put the onus on others. So he calls his counsellors together, and basically he says, look, see if you can find anything in the law about this situation that would help me, what I can do with my wife. So he's handballed it to somebody else. And so what we see, the assessors. Now, these 7 assessors were, if you like, his trusted advisors. And, if I'm one of his advisors, I know which way the wind's blowing. I don't want to lose my head. So I know which direction the king is pointing, what he wants to find out. So he has this group of assessors, and they're the highest people in the area. And the approach or the appraisal, the king says, "What does the law say must be done to Queen Vashti? She's not obeyed the command of King Xerxes, which the eunuchs took to her." So he has put this all on the advisors. You know, it's their problem as much as it is his. The case was examined. You know, you find out which way. You find something for me that I can deal with it. And the approach we had in there, one of his chief advisors made this approach. He basically is saying with it just what the king wanted to hear. And he wastes no time in laying the blame at Vashti's feet, and he then drags in all the other women in the kingdom. You know, if the queen gets away with this, we'll have a problem. All us henpecked husbands will have a problem in that the husbands will not be able to do, or the wives won't do as they're told, because Queen Vashti has set a bad example. So we've got to punish her for it. And the assertion is given, which we'll pick up today. "So our king, if it pleases you, give a royal order. Let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be changed. The law should say, Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also let the king give her place as queen to someone who is better than she is. And let the king's order be announced everywhere in this enormous kingdom. Then all the women will respect their husbands from the greatest to the least." What a statement. What a statement. But it's a very smart statement when you think of Memucan, because he doesn't say or get himself offside with the king. He says, if it pleases you, what I present to you, then act quickly. Don't think about it, just act quickly and deal with the matter before, you know, things escalate and get out of control. Because his thinking is very simple. If the king does nothing and Vashti is allowed to continue as queen, it's inviting all the women in the kingdom to rebel against their husbands. And of course, Xerxes, being the wise king, he says, now, hang on a minute. No, he's very pleased with this presentation, and so he signs the document quickly. Doesn't even hesitate, doesn't think about it, he just signs it. And as far as he's concerned, that's the end of the problem. But Vashti, she was the problem, or seemed to be the problem, and no thought was given to her that she was a victim, because this was something the king had brought upon himself. She had been found guilty, she was judged, she wasn't allowed to defend herself, nor was she allowed to have anybody else defend her. It was a done deal. All that was required was the punishment. So I think that's where we left it. And the agreement, the king and his important men were happy with his advice. So King Xerxes did as Memucan suggested. He sent letters to all the states of the kingdom in the writing of each state, in the language of each group of the people. These letters announced that each man was to be the ruler of his own family. Wow. Now, the king's happy. The men are happy. The presentation's been written up. It's made into law. It couldn't be changed according to their laws. So once it had been written, that was it. I find it interesting that once it's written, you can't do another letter or another decree to undo what you've just done. It became permanent. Now, the Jewish Midrash says, when Xerxes grew sober, he understood and regretted what he'd done. He recalled Vashti and her proper behaviour. In other words, the way she conducted herself. He also remembered how he had gone about improperly condemning her. Another tradition has the king wanting his wife. When the effects of this, if you like, party had worn off. According to the Midrash, he was told, "You killed her." He asked why. They replied, "You said for her to come before you naked, and she did not come." He admitted to them, "I did not act nicely." "And who counselled me to kill her?" They told him, "The 7 ministers of Persia and Media." He immediately killed them. Consequently, the 7 eunuchs are not mentioned again in the book of Esther, which is true. But all this is according to the Jewish Midrash. It's not according to Scripture. We're left to assume certain things here. But Vashti was removed, and these 7 eunuchs are not mentioned again in the book. So it's interesting. Now, when we look at Vashti, she would have known when she said no what that would mean. To not do as the king commanded, and yet she was prepared to face the repercussions of her actions. Her choice, his drunkenness, his anger, the officials' insecurity act together to actually strip away Vashti from her position. But what it does, it shows that she has the courage to make the right choice, even though she knew it would cost her a lot. Our culture seeks to find scapegoats for all the wrongdoing in society. But anyone who opposes the prescribed agenda, who doesn't follow the script, for anyone who says no, it's becoming increasingly difficult for people to stand up and say, "No, that's wrong. No, that's not right." Our society isn't interested in truth. It's not interested in facts or figures. It wants what it wants. It will not allow anyone to stand in the way of progress when they believe it will be a benefit for all society. For us as believers, there will be costs involved when we say no, but our consciences will be free before God, and we can trust that God is working all things out. Now, in fairness, Vashti was not a sinless woman, but she did stand up for what was right. It cost her a throne and maybe her life because of a stand. In all these things, God was working to deliver his people who had no idea about what was happening or going to happen to them. As one old-time commentator says, God didn't make Xerxes drunk, nor did he put the desire in his heart to display his wife to all the drunken lords and nobles. But he does use Vashti's decline to provide for his people by bringing Esther for such a time as this. And God is still moving in our times today. He hasn't gone AWOL. His handprints are all over what is happening. But he wants his people be prepared to stand for the truth and don't go with the flow that's happening as our society turns pagan. He wants us to be faithful and true and trust him to work out his plans. Well, I did finish it earlier than I want. I do have these if you want them. I've just called this You Little Beauty. And it's looking at chapter 2. And I know we won't get through just these first 9 verses, but it's called You Little Beauty. So far we've been presented a glimpse of the power struggles, a glimpse of the Persian palace life between the king and queen, and between the important people in society. Xerxes was a man with immense wealth and power. He had desires to expand the Persian borders, and as far as he was concerned, nothing was going to stop him from achieving that. And this included the integrity and the dignity of his own wife. He wanted her to do what he wanted her to do, and she said no. Here in the 2nd chapter of Esther, we find the king is engaging in a search for a new queen, someone to replace Vashti. So someone came up with the idea of a pageant, a beauty pageant. It was promoted throughout the kingdom, where all suitable contestants, and I use this word, were conscripted. They had to be available to allow the king to make his choice. Now, as we look at this scenario, today we're inclined to shake our heads at such goings on. But we forget that during these times, God had his hand upon his people and was orchestrating these events to provide and protect his people. They've been taken into captivity because of their rebellion and rejection of him. But God had not abandoned them. He was working things out according to his promises and plans he'd given them. And the same is true for us as Christians today. God hasn't abandoned us and left us to our own devices. He is working behind the scenes to do everything that he has promised to do. We look at the proposed search here in verses 1 through 4. Now, I found a statement that I thought was interesting. Do circumstances determine our character? True or false? Do circumstances determine our character? True? False? It's not a trick question. It just needs us to carefully think about it for a moment. Do circumstances determine our character? You see, many psychologists, many experts in this field say, yes, it does. But experts are wrong. Because circumstances do not determine our character, they reveal it. You see? We've got to think about it just for a moment. When the circumstances hit us, it reveals what's really inside us. It doesn't determine who and what we are. Our character is much more than our reputation. Reputation is only what others see or think about us. Our character determines who we really are, even when nobody else is watching. Success or failure results in how we respond to life situations and circumstances. Our overall character is made up of specific individual traits or qualities, and everyone has a different mix of these character traits. It is your character qualities, your character traits that determine how you will respond in any given situation. Take, for example, I find a great deal of money sitting in the footpath outside my house, and I'm in a considerable amount of money. What should I do with it? Spend it! But what does my character say? You see, the circumstances have presented me with an opportunity. My character says, yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. My character says, no, it's not mine. My character says, because I'm honest, maybe somebody's lost this, and no, it's a terrible loss. So the right thing for me to do is to hand it in. That's what my character says. But my circumstances says, don't be an idiot, pick it up. They lost it, it's theirs. Take it, it's yours. Finders keepers, losers weepers. But you see, my circumstances don't determine my character. It reveals my character in what I do. and how I respond to situations. As we look at this chapter, we're going to see how God used circumstances in Esther to reveal her character, to put her in a position where she could influence the king to protect her people. I've called this "You Little Beauty" because Xerxes thought he could be happy, thought he could be satisfied by finding a new queen. And to do that, you have a beauty contest. And guess what? He's the sole judge. He determines who is the best. So he's happy. The circumstances have been presented to him. Have a beauty pageant. Well, we see the perspective. Later on, when King Xerxes was not so angry, he remembered Vashti and what she had done and his order about her. So after these things, it gives us a bit of a clue what's happening here. And it's speaking about the time from when Vashti was removed as queen at the end of chapter 1 to the beginning of chapter 2, where we are now. And in that span, in this time, equates to about a 3-year event or difference. From the time he got rid of Vashti to this time now is 3 years. So what had he been doing? You remember in chapter 1, what was the idea of party? To convince the elite to go forth and invade Greece. That was what his whole purpose was. So when he got rid of Vashti, he occupied his mind and thoughts with invading Greece. As one commentator states, Xerxes and his Persian army crossed the Dandels, also known as Hellespont, and the first thing he encounters is Leonidas and the 300 Spartans. He eventually overcomes them. He then goes on to Athens and levels the Acropolis, and then the first Parthenon. Then they proceed down to Isthmus to get to Corinth, and the larger portion of Greece that's cut off by the Corinthian Canal. And at this time he receives word that the Persian army has been defeated by Themistocles at the Battle of Salamis. As Xerxes and his Persian army turn around, they begin to retreat back to Persia, and they're met by 100,000 Greek soldiers. Mardonius, one of Xerxes' general, misinterprets the movements of these Greek forces. He orders the Persians to give chase, and the Greeks finally defeat the Persians. Xerxes barely escapes. He gets the remainder of his army back to Susa. This is where he is in verse 1. He's not in a happy space. He's very angry. He is bitter. And so he's on his own, left with his thoughts. And because he's been he's got a reputation for temper tantrums, it's best to give him his space while he's getting over this bitterness that things haven't gone right. But the thing is, there's nobody there at the palace to greet him. He hasn't returned home as a triumphant conqueror. In fact, he returns with his tail between his legs because the Greeks inflicted another victory over him the same way his father was defeated. And that's pretty hard to bear. So once again, he's not a pretty picture of happiness. So he walks back into the palace. In Susa, there's nobody there. No one to hug him. There's nobody to greet him. Nobody say, "Oh, there, you poor thing. Everything's going to be all right." And so we read, after these things, in other words, after suffering this terrible embarrassment of the Greeks actually defeating him and his massive army, he comes back and he's on his own. So he is remembering Vashti. He's remembering what she did and remembering his decree against her. There's an interesting word in the Hebrew. Zakar is the word that's used. And it's used to describe a nostalgic term. And it's got this idea here, she used to be here. In other words, he's thinking of Vashti. He's thinking about her, the life that he had with her, and he comes to that thing, well, you know, previously when I went out and I came back, guess who was there? She was there. She greeted me at the door. She used to care for me. And so it's a reality check. Sometimes you don't appreciate something in life until it's gone. And this is one of those reflective moments for Xerxes. She's not there. He has nobody. He's lonely, he's hurting, he's depressed. He remembers Vashti for her beauty. But he also remembers, but she refused to obey me. And the law he had made to banish her. He knew he couldn't reverse it once it had been made into law. If it was possible, he would have removed that law and taken Vashti back as queen. And we would not have anything else in the book of Esther. It would not be here for us. The point is, God is a God of details. He is sovereign over the circumstances of our life. And that should give us cause for an inner sense of calm and peace in knowing the one who holds all things together. He holds the events of our life in his hand. He's able to bring about good, not only from evil, but also the meaningless, ordinary, everyday things that we encounter in life. As his friends, as his advisors watch him, they come up with a plan to cheer him up. They would hold not a Miss Universe contest, but a Miss Persian contest. It would come where all the young ladies from across the kingdom would come before the king, and he would choose who was to be his new queen. That's what they believed would cheer him up. Well, this was their proposal. Then the king's personal servant suggested, let a search be made for beautiful young girls for the king. Let the king choose supervisors in every state of his kingdom to bring every beautiful young girl to the palace of Susa. They should be taken to the women's quarters, put under the care of Hegi, the king's eunuch in charge of the women, and let beauty treatments be given to them. Well, when this proposal was put to Xerxes, he thought all these Christmases had come at once. What a wonderful plan. I mean, he's now an eligible bachelor. Who would not want him? Such a good catch. Who could refuse someone like the king? The advisors knew which buttons to push to please Xerxes. Had decided the time was right for him to find a new queen, 3 years. They came up with this plan. They proposed him to hold the Miss Persian pageant, where the criteria was for them to be young, beautiful, and virgins. Those selected by the king would undergo a time of purification and preparation before the king finally crowned his queen. Now, the advisors would have been smart enough in their proposal. Now, why do you think they came up with a beauty pageant? Why did they think about this? Now remember, Vashti was beautiful, and that's what he remembered about Vashti. So if I'm one of his advisors, and I know how much Vashti meant to him because of her beauty, then the only way to make this man happy is to have a smorgasbord, if you like, of beautiful women. They had to be beautiful. They had to be single. They had to be virgins. They knew what made him tick, and they knew what made him happy. And they knew that if they came up with anything less in their presentation, it would have ended in failure. So they knew they were on the right track in this proposal. Those chosen would be taken to the palace quarters, provided with the best cosmetic treatments available to women to make them look good, beautiful, before they were presented to the king. Now think, ladies, 12 months beauty preparation. Anything and everything you can imagine to make you look beautiful. Would you go for it? It wouldn't cost you a cent. Well, as I thought about this, this would have been time-consuming for Xerxes because he ruled over 127 provinces. All the overseers were gathered together and they went out with the decree, if you like, let me put it a different way, with this invitation to partake in a beauty pageant. Now, there's no mention in the scriptures whether the parents were consulted, whether the king sought the parents' approval for their daughters to be allowed to go in this contest. After all, he was the king, and you didn't refuse the king's invitation at all. Now, digging a little deeper, Josephus, the Jewish historian, says about this time and in the province, how many young women do you think were gathered from 127 provinces? You could say biggest mob. Well, there's a definite number. There were 400 young and beautiful women who were virgins that were selected to take part in this beauty pageant. Think about it. There's 400 of the most beautiful women in all of Persia, and he only has to pick one of them. One of them. Now we need to understand the reasoning of the advisors in this situation and why they would suggest having such an event when even by their own society standards this was unusual, where the king was able to pick from the best and most beautiful from women from all over the kingdom. It wasn't something that was normal for Persian society. If you're a single young Persian man looking for a wife, you want exactly what the king wants. Here he is, taking away the best and most beautiful and fairest of women, and you have no options left. How would you feel? You have the same desires, the same ambitions as the king, but he's taken away and exercised his power of the 400 of the most beautiful in the land. And to make things worse, the king only takes one of these women to be his queen, while the 399 remain in his harem as his possessions. Tell me that that's fair. But those are the days in which they lived. Now once again we see the nature and character of Xerxes revealed, where he can do whatever he wants. He is the king. Those women are born to be the property and possession of any man who can purchase them with his money or exercise power over them. That's the way it was. I'm not saying it's right, but I'm saying that's the time in which we're dealing with. The king's behaviour was expected in a country where men thought they had the right to multiple wives as long as they could get them and support them. And it seems the king wasn't concerned about the welfare of those under his control. He felt superior, above his people, and his power and wealth entitled him to satisfy his sensual and sexual appetites in any way he chose. He was the king. So we'll leave it there, but as you can see, it doesn't paint a pretty good picture of Xerxes. But it does, as I wanted us to be able to see, circumstances don't determine character. They reveal character. And this is showing us the character and nature of Xerxes. It shows us the situation into which Esther is going to be thrown. And it's going to bring out her character as well. So it reveals who she is and how the Lord uses her. So next week we'll pick up. So don't throw those papers away, but use them.